And instead, I'm going to go to two other sliders. Those sliders are called highlights and shadows. Highlights works on bright-ish stuff. So if my sky is too bright right now, which I think it is, then it's highlights that is going to help me to adjust it. If I move it to the right, it will brighten it. Move it to the left, it will darken it. If it's the dark-ish stuff that is having the issue, then it's the shadow slider I'm going to use. And I think that's the case in the right side of this photograph. So I'll bring shadows up. If you move it to the left, it'll darken. If you move it to the right, it'll brighten. And that's true of any of these sliders. Another slider I could use for something like this would be contrast. Contrast is how big of a difference is there between bright and dark. So if there's too great of a difference between bright and dark, which is somewhat what we started with, we had a bright sky and a dark shadow, contrast controls how big of a difference there is between bright and dark. If I bring it up, there'll be a greater difference between bright and dark. If I bring it down, there'll be less of a difference. They'll become more similar. Somewhere around there. Let's go to a different picture. I'm going to go to the library module by clicking on the word library, and I'll just go find another image. Click over on develop to adjust it. And so let's work with the same sliders. If I think the image as a whole is too bright or too dark, it's the exposure that I go to. Might only move it a little bit though, because then the problem starts becoming isolated to the brightest or darkest areas. If it's the brightish or darkish areas, then it's highlights and shadows I'm going to go to. So if I want more shadow detail, I'm going to bring up shadows. If I want the highlights to become darker, I'm going to bring down highlights. In previous versions of Photoshop, I keep saying Photoshop because I'm used to teaching Photoshop. In previous versions of Lightroom, if you moved the equivalent to highlights and shadows to an extreme, it was very easy to get artifacts in your picture where you would see an edge around the edge of your picture, like where something dark touches something bright, and that's not common in the newer versions. So you can move these sliders to very extreme settings. If there's still too big of a difference between bright and dark, I can go to contrast. Either increase that difference between the two or bring it down to decrease it. I'm going to go back to library. Let's try another one. Well, this image as a whole, minus the sky, looks way too dark, so I might start with exposure, bring it up, see what I can get out of that image. Once I get the image as a whole to start looking okay, the problem is mainly isolated to the highlights in that the bright part of the picture is missing detail. And so I'll go to the highlights slider, bring it to the left, which is going to darken the highlights. All right. Now there are a bunch of other things I can do with all of these images to make them even better, but right now I'm limiting us to features we've already talked about. Later on, like tomorrow, when we get into more advanced adjustments, I would be able to do something to the waterfall to really make it pop a lot more, because right now it looks a little bit dull. But just so you're aware, I'm limiting the tools that I'm using to what we talked about already and trying to slowly ramp us into that stuff. I will be getting into things where I could enhance this much more so in the future. One thing that I find to be useful when I'm adjusting my images is to look at a histogram. The histogram can be found in the upper right when you're in the Develop module. So as long as you're in the Develop area, on the right side I find a choice called Histogram. Mine is collapsed down because the little triangle next to it is collapsed. If I click on the triangle, I can expand it. And what this does is it shows me what tonal range is in my picture. In general, what that means is just what brightness levels are present within my picture. The one thing I really wish they would show here, but they never do, is imagine that there was a gradient at the bottom of this. To show you what I mean, let me get Photoshop open. This is a histogram here. We have an overly simplistic file, so it doesn't have. Imagine you copied that